Hi, welcome to another video. We'll be doing a portrait today and I'm showing you the colors I'm using. This is a nice gray color. We'll also be using darker color, Payne's gray. And as always, I'm using black. In this case, ivory black. It's a warmer black. And I also have two pencils by Derwent. They're ink pencils, so they're waterproof in black and gray. These are my brushes, some watercolor and an acrylic angled brush. And this is my trusted IKEA brush. Cost me about 20 cents. It's great. I made some sketches, some thumbnails in my sketchbook, and I'm going to use the bottom one. It's a very simple one, and we're just starting out with some sketching some features very lightly. You don't need dark lines or anything. It's really just to know where things are on your paper in terms of composition. And I always wet my paper a little bit on beforehand, especially when you start doing the larger blocks of color. So just blocking in some dark areas in my composition. They're going to be darker later. With watercolor, you really have to anticipate layering your values. So it's possible to create really dark values at once. But if you're inexperienced like I am with watercolor, or you're unsure, you may want to start with a lighter value and build it up towards something that you like. I'm really just generally blocking in shapes here. It doesn't have to be right in terms of detail. The only thing you need to keep in mind is that you position them right, and that's where your sketch comes in. If you misplace your basic features, you're going to have a lot of trouble correcting that once it's dry. What I'm doing here is I have a piece of toilet paper. I made it a little damp, and I'm just dabbing at the paint, and at some point I get tired of my efforts and I just wipe everything. And wiping over wet paint or a little damp creates a nice texture, I think. I do it with charcoal as well. Speeding this up a little more, I'm adding in some more darker values. You can lift your paper or board, whatever you're painting on, if you want the paint to move into certain areas that are wet. Adding in some gray here. This is sort of a greenish gray. Sennelier calls it Sennelier gray, which I think is great. It's a nice gray. It's a bit of a sage color. I'm going to use it mainly for the lighter midtones. so medium light, if you will. With a face that's tilted slightly, sometimes your brain doesn't see all the proportions right, and it helps to rotate your paper a little bit so that the angle of the face is straight, looking straight at you, and that way you can see if your proportions are right. I personally have a tendency to draw and paint too far to the right, so everything's sticking out on the right side. So I'm constantly remeasuring my proportions, and especially paying attention to whether everything is still straight. If the middle of the mouth is in the middle of the nose, and the middle of the nose is in between the two eyes. This bluish color is Payne's Gray, which is a blue gray, obviously. I'm going to use it to paint in the features of the eye. I'm pushing around a lot of paint here, and like I said before, I'm not a very experienced watercolor painter. I just don't practice enough to become efficient at watercolor painting, so I probably push my paint around way too much, which is not a good habit and not something you want to get into. This is my flat angled brush. It's actually not a watercolor brush, it's an acrylic brush. I should really get a proper angled watercolor brush. It's nice to draw in shapes, but because it's an acrylic brush, it doesn't load a lot of water. As you can see here, while I'm working on the eyes, that obviously my mouth is completely off center, and fortunately it's still very light at this point, so I will correct that. And no matter how well I pay attention, this is something that always happens to me. The thing with watercolor also, the reason why I'm always a little stressed when working with them is that not everything can be corrected. I mentioned that earlier. When you paint with acrylics and even with oil, you can just paint over entire parts. I spent so much time just painting over entire faces or entire parts that it was less work painting it again than trying to correct it. And with watercolor you can't do that because it's translucent, and because your whitest white excuse me, your whitest parts are always your paper. So the minute you try and correct things, most of the time you're darkening them. Like I mentioned earlier, it's important in an early stage, when you're still working with a light value, to get your basic proportions right. So let's give it a try and see if we can get the mouth to actually be in the center. No, the center is in the center, because the right part is sticking out too much. It's not a problem if that's, you know, if it's a little bit wider on one side. We're not all models, and where the face is not symmetrical. What you're, you know, what I'm trying to avoid is where you look at a painting and you go like, okay, yeah, I messed that up. You don't want to make obvious mistakes. In general, the corners of the mouth are somewhere aligned in the eye, depending on the width of your mouth. Your corner is often aligned with the center of your iris, or a little bit to the right, or a little bit to the left. I find mouths difficult to paint and even to draw, so I spend a lot of time on them. So at this point, my features are pretty much done and detailed, and I'm just adding in some more midtones to tie it all together. Adding in some darker values. I really want the right side to be overall at least 1 or 2 values darker than the left side. And it's always a bit of a challenge to try and find that balance between shadow and maintaining your shape there. I find it very difficult to paint accurate shadows and still maintain the shape of the face. And for some reason that is easier for me, at least in the lighter parts. So I'm always a little scared doing this. Looking back, I probably could have left this portrait alone at this point, but this is an exercise, And there's really no point in exercising anything if you're not willing to step outside your comfort zone a little bit and try some things that you normally don't do. I added in more medium light values, and I have a tendency to draw and paint a lot of high-key portraits, and it just gets tired after a while. So I wanted to see if I could create something interesting by lowering the values on the left side of the face, adding in some marks, some lines here with crayon. It's an interesting way of adding, well, a little more focus. After some thought and maybe too much coffee, I decided to add in gesso. And I wasn't happy at this point with my composition. So we're near the end and I'm almost done. I enjoyed this exercise. I learned a lot, and it was nice to take out my watercolors again. I might do that again in the future. And I hope you remember that when you exercise, don't be afraid to make mistakes. Nobody's watching. Honestly, nobody cares. It's just for you. And it's a great way to try some new things and see if certain techniques go together and maybe they don't. Really, the only way to know if something's going to work is to try it out and see if you can come up with something creative. Thanks so much for watching my video. If you enjoyed it, maybe you'll want to watch a few others, and be sure to subscribe to my channel. And I'll see you next time.